For centuries, scholars and believers opened their Bibles believing they had the entirety of divine revelation in their hands. However, an ancient manuscript known as the Book of Jubilees casts a shadow over this certainty. Why has a text that delves into detail about creation, sacred time, and God's laws been kept out of most versions of the Bible? What was it about its pages that provoked the silence of the councils and the denial of their content in entire traditions of Christianity? The answer may lie in the very nature of what this book reveals. Far beyond a simple repetition of Genesis, the Book of Jubilees reconstructs the foundations of sacred history based on another perspective, deeply organized, structurally rigid, and theologically bold. It's not just about narrating the same events in a new light. It's about questioning what was actually considered acceptable to be broadcast and what was excluded because it was perhaps too dangerous. In a world where most sacred texts were carefully compiled and filtered through councils and political decisions, the Book of Jubilees survived in the margins. It remained preserved in Ethiopian tradition while being discarded by rabbinical Jews, Latin Christians, and Eastern Orthodox churches. This is not just a forgotten book. It is a rejected document whose contents directly challenge some of the most solid structures of institutionalized faith. Among its pages, we find descriptions of angels who organize the universe according to celestial calendars, laws transmitted from the first humans, and interpretations of patriarchs who transform their image from tribal leaders into cosmic agents. This text was not written to complement what was already known, but to reformulate the understanding of the covenant between God and humanity, from creation to the days of Abraham, going through revelations that precede Moses by millennia. It is curious to think that, while many see the Bible as a closed, complete, and self-sufficient compendium, there are traditions that even today consider the Book of Jubilees part of their official scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for example, maintains this text in its canon, valuing it for its chronological accuracy and its deep respect for divine order. This raises another inevitable question. If this more detailed version of sacred history was maintained by one of the oldest branches of Christianity, why was it forgotten or rejected in the rest of the world? The answer may not only lie in doctrinal aspects, but in the threat that this book represents to certain theological interpretations that have consolidated over time. The way Jubilees approaches time, for example, is not just a matter of calendar. It is a radical realignment of the way humans should live, in harmony with a heavenly rhythm determined by God and observed by angels. Neglecting this sacred time would be, according to the text, a rupture of the covenant, a departure from the cosmic order, a kind of chronological heresy. The idea that time was structured by God at the moment of creation and that human beings should follow it rigidly is one of the many statements present in this work that for many seem too harsh, too specific, or even too uncomfortable. But if it was political and dogmatic criteria that defined what was acceptable in Scripture, perhaps it is time to look again at what was left out, not because it was less true, but because it was more demanding. This book does not offer an invitation to curiosity. It challenges traditional understanding. He states that the history we know may be incomplete, and that the pillars of spirituality that we have guided for generations may be supported by selective versions of the original events. If there is a story that was hidden, not by mistake, but by decision, then rescuing it is more than an intellectual choice. It is a spiritual need. Over the generations, much has been discussed about the laws, commandments, and deeds of the patriarchs. However, what is rarely observed is the role of time as a divine institution. In the Book of Jubilees, time is not just a measurement of days and nights. It is a sacred structure, established by God at the very beginning of creation. This concept differs radically from what has become tradition in most ancient and modern cultures. And it is precisely here that one of the most sensitive and revolutionary points of the text begins: the defense of an exact solar calendar, determined by celestial orders, which should be followed by all humanity. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and follow content like this, which reveals little explored details of ancient traditions. There is a lot of material that doesn't usually appear out there, and here you will have access to it in a clear, well-organized and well-founded way. According to the text, when God created the world, He not only formed the earth, the heavens, and living beings, He also created a universal rhythm. This rhythm is represented by a calendar that follows the solar cycle, with 364 days distributed in 4 perfect seasons of 91 days each. This structure ensures that life cycles, such as harvests, religious festivals, and the Sabbath, always occur at the same periods, year after year. Nothing is random. Everything has order and regularity. This regularity, however, was abandoned over time, and it is here that the book points out a rupture between God's original will and the practices adopted by people who began to use the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar, unlike the solar calendar, has irregular months, alternating between 29 and 30 days, which requires frequent adjustments, such as additional months. This causes the dates of festivals and holy days to shift over the years. According to the Book of Jubilees, this deviation is not just a practical error, it is a spiritual violation. By adopting a calendar that does not align with what was established in the heavens, humanity moves away from the divine plan. Saturday stops falling on the correct day. Celebrations lose their correspondence with the sacred cycle. The angels, in charge of observing and organizing the times according to the Creator, see human creation disconnecting from heaven. The text is emphatic. There are spiritual consequences for anyone who breaks this harmony. This theme gains even more strength when we realize that the calendar described in the Book of Jubilees bears similarities to the traditional Ethiopian calendar still used today by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This calendar divides the year into 12 months of 30 days, with a 13th month of 5 or 6 days, depending on the year. Despite technical differences, the principle is similar. An attempt to preserve a regular solar structure in contrast to the Gregorian calendar adopted in the West, which is adjusted with leap years and periodic correction rules. This is not a technical or cultural detail. The calendar is presented as one of the first sacred institutions. Even before the laws were delivered at Sinai, before the prophets proclaimed their messages, there was already an order to be followed: divine timing. This understanding is central to the thinking of the Book of Jubilees. Following the correct calendar is not a matter of human choice, but a response of obedience to heavenly command. The angels themselves, created on the first day, are responsible for maintaining the regularity of the heavens. The sun, moon, and stars follow their courses according to the direction of these beings, and it is through this cosmic obedience that time is organized. The moment humans start following another type of counting, based on the phases of the moon, this harmony is broken. The text declares that this not only distorts true worship, but also weakens the connection between the heavens and the earth. This critique of the lunar calendar is particularly important because it reflects an ancient conflict between religious groups in the Second Temple period. Most Jews, especially after the Babylonian exile, followed the lunar Babylonian calendar, which would later become the traditional Hebrew calendar. The Book of Jubilees, however, represents the views of a splinter group, quite possibly the Essenes, known for living in separate communities and following strict norms based on purity and ritual exactitude. These groups preserved the solar calendar as part of their religious identity, arguing that it was more faithful to God's original revelation. The defense of the solar calendar, therefore, is linked to a broader notion of covenantal fidelity. It is not about measuring time just for practical purposes, but about aligning the rhythm of human life with the rhythm established in heaven. According to the text, following the correct calendar would be a way to restore the primordial order that was established at creation and lost over the generations. The Book of Jubilees insists that there are consequences to this loss of alignment. Not by chance, the text states that many will fall into error by observing the moon and adjusting the sacred days based on its variation. This deviation would cause confusion in rituals, seasons, and even in the testimony of faith. By abandoning the solar rhythm, the people lose the regularity of sacred times, making what should be holy abominable. More than a criticism of the lunar calendar, this message carries a warning. When the divine structure is ignored, chaos ensues. And it is not just social or civil chaos, but a profound spiritual distancing. Time, from the perspective presented by this book, is a sacred code, and whoever breaks it breaks with the Creator himself. If this content is touching you in any way, write Amen in the comments. This shows us that you are with us on this journey and strengthens this message to reach even more people. This way of thinking about time as an inviolable law engraved on the heavenly tablets completely changes the way we understand biblical history. The covenant between God and humans does not begin with rules written in stone. It begins with the rhythm imposed on creation, a kind of silent pact that orders existence and guides worship, morals, and community life. The idea that divine laws were delivered only from Mount Sinai is a common basis in many religious traditions. However, the Book of Jubilees presents a radically different view. In this account, God's commandments do not arise with Moses, nor are they the result of a later civil organization. They have been part of creation since the earliest days and were communicated to humanity through heavenly messengers, angels. This concept completely transforms the understanding of the origin of sacred laws. The text states that Adam, shortly after his formation, received instructions on how to live, what to observe, and how to maintain communion with the Creator. Such guidelines were not improvised or adapted to the human context. They were delivered according to eternal records, preserved on celestial tablets, a type of divine archive that would store not only laws, but also future events, sacred dates, and universal principles that regulate heaven and earth. Angelic mediation is another central aspect of this narrative. Angels are not just distant spiritual creatures. They are active agents of the divine will. According to the Book of Jubilees, it was these beings who instructed Adam, taught Noah after the flood, and guided the patriarchs such as Abraham and Jacob. Every law, every precept, every rule of purity or conduct was communicated based on a greater plan established by God and transmitted by his messengers. This transmission does not take place in symbolic language. The instructions are clear and precise. The Sabbath, for example, is presented as an eternal institution, celebrated not only by men, but also by angels. Rest on the seventh day would not just be a social or religious custom, but a reflection of a heavenly reality. When humans keep the Sabbath, they align themselves with the rhythm of heaven. Failure to do so represents a departure from the divine order, a break in harmony between the visible and the invisible. The same goes for purity laws. In the Book of Jubilees, these norms were already in force from the earliest times. Adam was instructed on how to behave, how to keep himself pure, and how to offer sacrifices. These rituals were not just symbolic acts, but concrete gestures of fidelity to the original covenant. The laws that would later be codified by Moses were already being observed by much earlier figures, which reinforces the idea of the continuity and eternity of these instructions. This perspective directly confronts the understanding that the Torah represents an initial milestone in divine legislation. For the author of the Book of Jubilees, the Torah does not inaugurate the laws, but reaffirms them. Moses would be just one of the links in the chain of revelation, not the starting point. The instructions he receives had already been passed down from generation to generation since the beginning of humanity, through the angels and the faithful observation of the patriarchs. Another relevant point is the role of sacrifice. The practice of offering animals as burnt offerings does not begin with the Levitical system. In the text of Jubilees, both Adam and his descendants already knew how to make these offerings. There were clear criteria about which animals could be offered, under what circumstances, and with what intention. The offering was not just an act of devotion, but a way of restoring order when it was broken. These rituals were considered part of the original pact between God and humanity, revealed by his angels and maintained by those who considered themselves faithful to his will. This model of revelation, prior to any priestly structure or religious institution, reinforces the thesis that there is a superior, universal, permanent law. A law that is above cultural adaptations, historical contexts, or local traditions. Obedience to this law does not depend on the existence of a temple or a human mediator. It is written on the celestial tablets and can be accessed by anyone who seeks to align their life with the order established from the beginning. This understanding also changes the way we see the history of the patriarchs. Men like Noah, Abraham, and Jacob did not just have individual experiences with God. They were guardians of a sacred code that guided their decisions, their practices, and their alliances. They didn't create new paths. They followed paths already traced since the creation of the world. By stating that the commandments were given to the first humans and not just to the Hebrews in the desert, the Book of Jubilees expands moral and spiritual responsibility for all humanity. If Adam received laws and his children knew them, then the call to obedience is not restricted to a people or an era. He is universal, and more than that, it is timeless. This idea may explain in part why this text was rejected by many religious traditions. Recognizing that the laws did not emerge with Moses, but were transmitted from the beginning, challenges doctrinal structures that are based on specific historical landmarks. Furthermore, the central role of angels as intermediaries of divine will also contrasts with the later emphasis placed on human figures such as priests and prophets. The Book of Jubilees, by rescuing this celestial origin of the laws, puts the focus back on the direct relationship between God and humanity, mediated by beings that inhabit another dimension. This model of revelation takes away the monopoly of institutions and returns sacred knowledge to creation as a whole. Since the first accounts, human lineage has been presented as a guiding thread that connects creation to divine purpose. In the Book of Jubilees, this succession of generations carries a deeper heritage than just names in a genealogy. Each character, from Adam to Abraham, is embedded in a carefully plotted plane in which divine revelation is kept alive through preserved traditions, precisely past teachings, and practices that reflect an ancient commitment to the heavenly order. Adam, the first formed, not only received the breath of life, but also clear guidance on how to live. He was instructed to keep the Sabbath, maintain purity, and make offerings in accordance with precepts established by divine messengers. These norms, far from being improvised, followed a logic previously determined and recorded on eternal tablets, accessible only to celestial beings and those instructed by them. After Adam, this spiritual inheritance was not lost. It was transmitted to his descendants, especially to the lineage of Seth, seen as fair and obedient. Jubilees highlights that it was through Seth that the alliance with heaven found continuity, while other descendants gradually moved away from the original order. This rupture became most evident with Cain, whose transgression marked the beginning of a period of deviance and corruption. Abel's murder, in addition to being a crime against his brother, symbolizes a rejection of divine instruction and a break with the original harmony. The tradition maintained by Seth and his descendants develops in a context of resistance. The earth, little by little, becomes a space of conflict, where disobedience grows, violence spreads, and the values taught by the angels begin to be ignored. This scenario culminates in the days of Noah, when degradation reaches deep levels. The Book of Jubilees details this period, mentioning the actions of fallen spiritual entities who disseminate forbidden knowledge and pervert creation. They are, according to the text, responsible for the formation of giants, hybrid beings that further widen the distance between humanity and God's will. Noah, despite living in the midst of this chaos, represents a point of resistance. He is instructed directly by the angels to preserve what remains of the original purity. It receives laws about sacrifices, norms of behavior, and guidelines on how to maintain sanctity. Even after the flood, this commitment continues. Noah doesn't just emerge as a survivor, he assumes the role of restorer of the covenant. Your role is to reconnect creation with the Creator through faithful observance of everything that has been revealed to you. This continuity is also manifested in Noah's sons, among whom Shem stands out. It is from him that the line of promise is preserved. Although biblical history mentions this genealogy objectively, the Book of Jubilees adds layers of meaning, showing that this line is responsible for keeping alive the wisdom received since the earliest times. Shem's faithfulness ensures that the original principles are not forgotten, even as nations grow and peoples spread. It is in this scenario that Abraham appears. His story, as told in Jubilees, begins long before the call to leave his land. The text presents a young man who grows up in an environment steeped in idolatry. His father, Terah, is involved in practices foreign to the original covenant. However, from an early age, Abraham shows concern about the customs around him. The tradition preserved by Shem reaches him, and his conscience turns to the true God. The break with paganism is clearly described. Abraham destroys the idols in his father's house, rejects local cults, and chooses to live apart, in search of a direct relationship with the one who rules the heavens. This gesture is not just symbolic. It represents a conscious resumption of the lost alliance. Abraham does not receive a new revelation. He recognizes and returns to the original instruction, the same one that had been taught to Adam, confirmed in Noah, and protected by Shem. His relationship with angels, according to the book, is constant. He is guided by them, instructed in detail about laws, sacrifices, purity practices, and even the sacred calendar. Contrary to what many imagine, your loyalty is not born of chance or spontaneous faith. It is the result of profound knowledge transmitted by celestial sources and accepted with an unshakable disposition. Along his journey, Abraham becomes an example of someone who chooses to restore what had been forgotten. He does not build a new path, but returns to the path left by the first righteous people. Their commitment is not just to a promised land, but to a truth preserved in the margins of history. This silent tradition, passed down from generation to generation, is not presented as legend or folklore. For the Book of Jubilees, she is the backbone of the relationship between heaven and earth. Each patriarch, from Adam to Abraham, had his role within a lineage that preserves, protects, and transmits the fundamental values of creation. Following the lineage that began with Abraham, the text of the Book of Jubilees directs our attention to the descendants who would inherit not only lands and promises, but also the spiritual mission of keeping alive the covenant established since the beginning. The story of Jacob and Esau, therefore, is not limited to the dispute between two brothers for blessings and birthright. From the perspective of this ancient work, it represents the revelation of a deeper clash, the mismatch between two spiritual paths and the unfolding of a destiny traced long before the birth of the twins. The narrative suggests that, even in their mother's womb, the two already carried traits that would distinguish them. Rebekah, upon feeling the tension that was forming inside her, receives a divine revelation. It wasn't just about two children. There were two nations there that, in the future, would position themselves in opposite directions. The oldest would move away from the path of righteousness, while the youngest would continue the plan established by God since creation. This detail completely changes the way one interprets the sequence of events that follow. The episode in which Jacob acquires his brother's birthright and later receives Isaac's blessing ceases to be a simple family dispute and takes on the role of confirmation of a choice already determined in the higher spheres. The Book of Jubilees shows that the parents, especially Rebekah, were aware of Jacob's spiritual vocation. Their preference for him was not just emotional. She recognized him as the legitimate heir to the divine covenant. The contrast between the brothers goes beyond temperament. Esau is described as someone who is impetuous, focused on the wild, and more interested in immediate achievements than inherited values. Jacob, on the other hand, is portrayed as someone sensitive to heavenly guidance, committed to the laws received by his ancestors. His conduct is not perfect, but his inclination towards good and his willingness to obey what was revealed to him make him worthy of continuing the lineage of the righteous. This dichotomy deepens when the text deals with each person's descendants. Esau gives rise to a nation that, throughout the generations, would place itself as an adversary of the people of Israel. The book of Jubilees does not treat this as a coincidence. The trajectory of the Edomites, their constant rivalry with Jacob's sons, and their actions in opposition to divine principles are portrayed as a direct consequence of their ancestors' stance. It is not just a conflict between people, it is the material expression of a spiritual distance that begins with an individual choice and manifests itself in future generations. Jacob's trajectory is presented as the continuation of the larger plan. After receiving his father's blessing, he is instructed directly by God and heavenly messengers on how to lead his life and guide his family. Purity laws, the sacred calendar, Sabbath keeping, dietary norms, and sacrificial rites are all reaffirmed in its history. It's nothing new to him. They are confirmation of a legacy that he assumes with responsibility. The conduct of Jacob's life reflects this commitment. Even in the midst of challenges, travel, family conflicts, and uncertainty, he remains connected to what was passed on to him. His actions, his decisions, and his way of guiding his children reveal a man aware of his role in something bigger than himself. He understands that his mission goes beyond the personal scope. It is about preserving a pact that began before time was counted. The way the book of Jubilees describes the relationship between Jacob and Esau is not aggressive or simplistic. The text does not reduce Esau to a villain. He is, above all, a figure who represents a choice. Live according to impulses or submit to guidance that comes from above. His decision reflects a type of freedom that, although respected, leads to consequences that last a long time. The opposition between the two brothers and their descendants is presented as one of the axes of sacred history. Israel, the fruit of Jacob's lineage, is called to remain faithful to the covenant. Edom, generated by Esau, symbolizes those who choose to follow another path. This tension is not limited to antiquity. The book of Jubilees suggests that this opposition will continue to manifest itself in different forms as long as there are forces in the world that resist the divine plan. It is significant that the text addresses these issues within a panorama that transcends human conflicts. What unfolds in the story of the patriarchs is, in fact, a reflection of a broader reality. Jacob's faithfulness is not an isolated merit but the response to a call. His choice, although marked by errors and stumbles, brings him closer to what was revealed to his ancestors. Esau's trajectory symbolizes the gradual departure from a model that requires obedience, discipline, and alignment with the cycles and norms established since the beginning. This view broadens the reading of events and invites reflection on how individual decisions can reverberate in collective contexts. The covenant, as presented in the book of Jubilees, is not just a contract between God and a people. It is a bond built on foundations prior to the social organization itself and which is based on the transmission of principles from generation to generation. Over generations, fragments of a larger story have been preserved in texts such as the book of Jubilees, not just to record events, but to remember that there is an order above the human order, an alliance that did not begin in the desert, but in the first moments of creation. What we see there is not a new doctrine, but an old call, a reminder that the truth can remain alive even when removed from official structures. Deleting this book does not erase its message. On the contrary, it reinforces your uniqueness. In times when memory is fragmented and the roots of faith are forgotten, Recovering these voices is an act of return. Perhaps what has been silenced for so long is not lost, just waiting to be heard again. What if part of what we consider essential was just part? And if there is more that is not new but original? This is the type of question that texts like this don't answer directly, but leave echoing. Because some revelations are not enough to end discussions, but to open paths. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If this content made sense to you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Leave a like to help this material reach more people. And when you finish here, choose the next video to watch. There's a lot more content coming, and you'll want to follow it closely.